All right. Welcome to everybody who's joining us from all over the world. We will get started in just a minute. Okay. All right, I think this is slowed, so we will get started. Hello and welcome everyone to the fourth and final iIIRG in Conversation webinar of 2024. This is a production of the International Investigative Interviewing Research Group. My name is Christopher Kelly, and for those of you who have not heard the news, I am pleased to introduce Suzanne Flolo of the Norwegian Center for Human Rights. Together, we are the co-directors of iIIRG and are very excited that you are all here to learn more about interviewing vulnerable suspects. Suzanne, would you like to say hello?
Yes, hello, good morning and good afternoon to our iIIRG members and friends. As Chris said, my name is Susanne Flølo. I'm the rookie co-director of iIIRG, and I'm honored to join this group and very much look forward to the webinar, which Chris and Brian no doubt should have full credit for putting together. So my day job, apart from this directorship, is as a senior advisor for the Norwegian Center for Human Rights at the University of Oslo Faculty of Law, where I have specialized in investigative interviewing for years. So my experience spans collaboration on projects in Thailand, Ukraine, and with UN partners, and contributing to globally recognized initiatives and manuals. And as co-director, I aim to foster collaborations, expand our membership, and build global strategic partnerships. And I'm very excited to work together towards with all of you towards our shared mission and to advocate for the incredible work being done by our members already. So thank you for welcoming me, and I very much look forward to listening to the presentation today. And I will stop here to not take up more of your time, Laura and Keith. You are the reason that we are all gathered for this webinar after all.
Thank you, Suzanne. And I'll introduce and turn it over to our esteemed presenters in a moment, but a few announcements before we begin. For those of you new to iIIRG or to this webinar series, thank you for being here. We hope to get to know you through our various endeavors besides this webinar series, including our biennial in-person conferences and our journal, Investigative Interviewing Research and Practice, which I'll note we are accepting submissions for the first bilingual edition of the journal. So get those submissions in by 31st of May next year. Next, if you're not a member of iIIRG, we hope that you consider joining us to support events such as this webinar, plus gaining access to the largest worldwide network of investigative interviewing professionals and receiving discounts on future conferences, access to materials such as these webinar recordings, and networking grants, which we will be announcing early next year. Finally, if you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A box, and Susanna and I will be moderating a discussion after the presentations. So it is my honor to introduce today's speakers. First, we have Dr. Laura Farrugia, who is an assistant professor at Northumbria University in the United Kingdom. She also works as a registered intermediary, where she assists police forces in England and Wales when interviewing vulnerable witnesses and victims to ensure that they provide their best evidence. Dr. Farrugia's research experience relates to vulnerability, police interviewing of victims, witnesses, and suspects, and confessions, and she has published extensively in these areas. Finally, Dr. Farrugia provides training to international and national organizations regarding how best to interview those who are vulnerable. Next, we have Keith Harbottle, who has over 25 years of experience working in a police force in England and Wales. He has a wealth of experience in interviewing individuals involved in serious and complex abuse of vulnerable individuals. Formerly a national accredited detective in PIP Level 2 and specialist child abuse investigator, he has vast experience in interviewing vulnerable individuals from a witness, victim, and suspect perspective involved in serious and complex cases. Finally, he regularly provides expert consultancy to organizations throughout England and Wales. So Laura and Keith, welcome. Thank you for being here, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Right, I'm going to share my screen and hope that the technology works. Okay, thanks, Chris and Susanna, for a very warm welcome. Myself and Keith are delighted to be here with you all, and we're going to spend some time today talking about how we interview vulnerable suspects. So from my perspective, I'll talk for a little while about the psychology of interviewing vulnerable suspects, and then Keith will provide a real-life case study so we can see what actually happens in practice. So just to give you a small introduction, we know from the work that we do that vulnerable suspects are becoming increasingly overrepresented in the justice system. And the impact of vulnerability in the police interview in particular is becoming well documented. But despite this, it is still not a well-researched area, especially when we think about how we conduct a police interview. Now, interviewing a vulnerable suspect is not an easy task, and Keith will share some of his insights into doing that. But we have to be aware of the specific needs of the vulnerable suspect. It is really important for the justice outcomes. What we do know is that vulnerable suspects do not respond well to traditional methods of policing, and I'll be talking a little bit about the psychology behind that. So I'm sure that a lot of you are aware of what happened pre-1980s, but in England and Wales specifically, police officers did not receive any training, or they received very little. And what this meant is that they used a variety of manipulative and persuasive tactics. The onus was on seeking a confession, and at the time, the way that the police would interview suspects was encouraged very much by influential training manuals. The police were actually encouraged to interrogate rather than interview, and the onus was on obtaining a confession. Even at the turn of the century, it was still thought that you do not obtain a confession by asking the suspect questions. You have to convince the suspect to confess by the use of persuasive interrogational techniques. Now, those of you that are familiar or work in this area, I can imagine, are inwardly screaming. When I see quotes like this, it makes me worry about the way that police officers were interviewing vulnerable suspects. And those worries are actually needed, because what we do know is that the way that police officers were interrogating vulnerable suspects led to a number of miscarriages of justice and inquiries, especially in England and Wales. And a lot of scholars around that time were highlighting the unethical behaviour by interrogators. So those worries were becoming warranted. Scholars were identifying that unethical behaviour by interrogators had actually undermined public confidence, and it left the police service in England and Wales with a serious skills deficit in its ability to obtain their evidence through questioning. However, it wasn't until the early 1990s that Eric Shepherd, a well-renowned psychologist, advocated for a move towards the term investigative interviewing, and that he wanted to use this term to describe how police officers would interview victims, witnesses, and suspects. In 1991, the Home Office set up a steering group on investigative interviewing, and it comprised of members of the Police Service, the Home Office, and the Crown Prosecution Service to coordinate this work on interviewing. And as part of that, they started to look to develop training. Now, why is this important? Quite often, the police interview is the only source of forensic evidence in an investigation, especially if the case is a historic one. So when this steering group came together, they were aiming to try and come up with a more effective and ethical alternative to what was currently being conducted, i.e. persuasive interrogations. So the model of interviewing became known by its mnemonic, PIECE. Now, there is lots and lots of literature around the PIECE model of interviewing. So I won't labour too much on what it stands for. But the PIECE model is the 5 stages for interviewing in any type of situation with any type of interviewee. So victims, witnesses, and suspect, including those that are vulnerable. And what we now know is that the PIECE model is used in the UK, it's used in parts of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and in Europe. So the first stage is the plan and prepare. The second stage is engage and explain. The third stage is account, clarify, and challenge. The fourth stage is closure, and the final stage is evaluate. And the stage that we're particularly interested in when we talk about how to interview is the account, clarify, and challenge stage. When we look at how we interview anybody, it comes down to how we ask questions. So I always find that this quote is really quite pivotal whenever I do these types of talks. To ask a question is to apply one of the most powerful tools in communication. And indeed, there has been a lot of work conducted in terms of how we comprise our questioning strategies, or how we would define appropriate questioning strategies. So the interviewers must be able to ask appropriate questions. Their role now is to try and elicit as much information from their interviewee, in our case, the vulnerable suspect. But just because you are a police officer or an investigator, it doesn't mean that this is a skill that automatically comes naturally to you. It's a skill that you have to master, and it's a skill that you have to practice. What the literature currently says is that open-ended questions are the most appropriate for gaining maximum quantity and quality of information. And when we talk about open-ended questions, we mean ones that start with tell, explain, or describe, sorry. And these questions have been proven time and time again to elicit the most amount of information. So we have this PIECE model of interviewing. We've moved away from these interrogative methods and these coercive interview tactics and strategies. But what we need to look at is, does the PIECE model of interviewing actually work? Now, there was some early evaluation work conducted by Clark and Milne in 2001, and they conducted a national evaluation of the PIECE model where they examined 177 interviews that had been conducted with suspects and witnesses. And their early findings suggested that whilst there had been some improvements, the interview was still very much interviewer-driven and confirmatory. So what they meant was that interviewers were asking still far more leading questions. Most interviewers didn't allow the witness to speak and to tell their account, and the interviews were mainly police-led. So instead of allowing their victim, witness, or suspect to give their free recall and to give their account, actually the police officers were dominating the interviews. They also found that there was some evidence of planning and preparation, although they described this as not very good. They found that the caution and the right to legal advice had been provided, but again, with very limited explanation of the interview format. They also found, when they looked specifically at the questioning strategies, that yes, some open questions were being used, but that the majority of the questions were still very closed in nature. And only 16% of the interviews were closed in a clear and professional manner. So still some work to do based on this early piece of evaluation. And then as we move through the early 2000s, more and more scholars were exploring whether or not the PIECE model was being adhered to. So in 2008, Walsh and Milne looked at trained interviewers and wanted to explore what they were doing in their interviews. And they found that they were using more appropriate questions and fewer leading questions when compared to untrained interviewers, so those that weren't trained in the PIECE model. But they found this underriding principle that closed questions were still dominating interviews. Sekera and colleagues in 2009 found no evidence of unethical tactics, so issues such as minimization, maximization, and intimidation were no longer being used. But the closer stage of the peace model was still being conducted inadequately. The main issue that scholars were finding is that although the overall interviews were improving, interviewers were showing a decline in their skill set around 6 months to 1 year after receiving their training. So we know that there have been improvements in interview quality. We know that the peace model is somewhat successful in encouraging police officers to move away from interrogation and more to investigative interviewing. But what about vulnerable suspects? Do we know if the peace model is suitable? And specifically, do we know whether or not best practice questions, such as open questions, are suitable for vulnerable suspects? So before I dive into some of the research that is being conducted, I want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about what we mean by vulnerability. So there are a number of theoretical concepts and descriptions of what vulnerability can mean. So generally, it refers to the neediest of those facing difficulty, risk, or exposure. Some look at it from a victim perspective, where it might mean the heightened possibility of being attacked. Some would describe it as a state or condition whereby an individual is in danger or under threat, experiencing health challenges, or generally at risk. Scholars recently have tied this concept of vulnerability predominantly to victims of crime, and other scholars have highlighted that actually there are a number of fragmented definitions of vulnerability. So this can make it difficult right from the get-go in terms of how we identify vulnerability and how we would therefore behave in an interview with a vulnerable person. Perhaps one of the most well-known scholars that has conducted an immense amount of work in this area, Gisli Gudjonsson, he describes vulnerability as psychological characteristics or a mental state which would render an individual prone in certain circumstances to providing information which is inaccurate, unreliable, or misleading. So Gisli Gudjonsson highlights that you can have a vulnerable person where, because of their psychological characteristics or mental state, that may impact on how they communicate in a police interview, in that they might provide inaccurate, unreliable, or misleading information. And this is now reflected somewhat in the updated legislation in England and Wales. So in England and Wales, we are governed by the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, or PACE for short, and it's the associated codes, Code C in particular, that deals with vulnerable suspects. So what this code defines vulnerability as is anybody under the age of 18 years old, who we would class as a juvenile. And it also describes a vulnerable suspect as anybody who experiences the impact of their mental health on their ability to understand, communicate, and if they're prone to confusion, providing unreliable information, heightened levels of suggestibility and compliance. This guidance also refers to situational factors, which is quite a new addition to this definition. So it recognises that just by being in custody and being interviewed, that situational factor can make you more vulnerable than normal. When we have a vulnerable suspect come into custody, we would normally expect that there is an appropriate adult to assist them in the interview. So the appropriate adult can be any parent or guardian not tied to the case, not a witness, or any other responsible adult that would come in and assist that vulnerable person in their understanding through the interview process. But as I mentioned at the start of this PowerPoint, vulnerable suspects do not respond well to traditional methods of policing. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes now just telling you how that is and what the issues are when we talk about vulnerable suspects. So if we start with mood disorders can include depression, bipolar, and it affects at least 1 in 6 of us at any one time in our lifetime. When we look at the prison population, we know that mood disorders are highly prevalent. And when we look at the clinical presentation of someone with a mood disorder, we know that a mood disorder can impact upon that person's control of attention and their recall, and it can lead to biased memory processes. So how does that translate into a police interview? Well, we know that someone with a mood disorder may recall more negative rather than positive material, and that's because they tend to selectively attend to more emotional cues. It also can have an impact on their free recall. So if you think back to an open question at the start of an interview, tell me about your involvement with this crime, that free recall can be very difficult for somebody with a mood disorder to do. And that's because a free recall draws upon the episodic memory in an individual. And in someone who has a mood disorder, this can be impaired. So when we use open questions, it can actually allow for rumination, and it may not actually control the attention of the victim, or in this case, the suspect. And this can lead to the vulnerable suspect providing inaccurate information or falsely implicating themselves. Similarly, when we look at anxiety, we know again that this is a very common mental health condition. It's a worldwide mental health concern. And we know that if someone is experiencing anxiety, they will have impaired cognitive processes. And these relate specifically to intrusive thoughts and emotions, a dysregulated attention and concentration. And what this can lead to in somebody with anxiety is an attentional bias to threat, which then interferes with their performance in other tasks. We know that anxiety can be exacerbated by the environmental stressor of being in police custody. When someone is experiencing anxiety, it draws upon the majority of their neural resources, which are critical for memory. And this can again result in decreased accuracy and recall, as well as impairments in their episodic memory. Now, because an anxious person is experiencing these neural resources and these deficits, it can impair their working memory. So an anxious worry will reduce the working memory capacity of an individual. We use our working memory when we listen and try and process questions in an interview. If that person with anxiety has impairments in this particular process, it can then impact on their ability to attend to questions and respond accordingly. We have a lot of individuals that are neurodiverse entering custody. And we know that individuals with autism in particular may not encode, store, or retrieve contextual information in the same way as someone without autism. So if you think about the social impairments in phase processing and gaze perception that an individual with autism may have, they can find it very difficult to read the body language of the interviewer in front of them. Those with autism have been shown to have difficulties in their episodic memory as well, and in their source monitoring. So they have difficulties in their ability to recall where, when, how, or from who they learned something. If you ask someone with autism an open question and you don't provide them with the context or the scaffolding that they need, they will have these difficulties in source monitoring. And that can lead to a tendency to confabulate, so to try and make up some details. We know that the cognitive interview, that is a very well-known interview technique, uses techniques to draw upon remembering contextual information. So there is one technique called context reinstatement, and those with autism will find this very difficult to engage with that process and to then remember information. So we can see that there is a number of ways that the impact of vulnerability can play out in the police interview. Generally, we know that anybody with a vulnerability, particularly mental health or learning disabilities, can experience an overgeneral memory. So that's where they are unable to recall very specific memories rather and tend to recall more generic memories. And that's particularly prevalent in depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. So again, if you're asking an individual a very open question without providing them the scaffolding that they need, you are not supporting their cognitive abilities to provide and to try and recall the information that you would require. We know that vulnerable individuals overall tend to have heightened levels of suggestibility, compliance, and acquiescence. And we know that because of that, they are at a heightened risk of providing misleading information in their police interview. So we can see from a clinical perspective and from a forensic research perspective that current interview techniques may not be suitable for not only vulnerable suspects, but for vulnerable victims. Katie Maris, for example, has conducted a lot of research in this area, and she has found that when the cognitive interview is used with individuals that have autism, they actually report more incorrect details. And similar findings have been found in those that have a learning disability. Scholars have also found that a free recall, so asking that very open question, can be very difficult for children. And that's because they have less retrieval strategies. Their cognitive abilities are not fully developed, and therefore it can result in more errors. So before I hand over to Keith, I'm going to talk very briefly about some research that myself and Professor Fiona Gabbett conducted in 2019. We found that when vulnerable suspects are being asked open questions, it is leading to more confusion and less information being provided overall. And in that particular piece of research, we examined real-life police interview transcripts, we analysed suspect interviews, and this is what we found. We then wanted to follow it up with a piece of experimental work in 2020. So we were particularly interested to bring participants into the lab to test two different interview models. So we used the best practice model, which is currently in existence. Our participants were turned into suspects by stealing 2 items, and then they were interviewed in one of 2 ways. One way being the best practice, so lots of open questions, and the second method using a modified interview that contained more specific and closed questions. So we wanted to explore which interview model would elicit the most amount of information and the most accurate amount of information. And we also wanted to see, therefore, what interview model is more appropriate for vulnerable suspects. Our participants, as I mentioned a moment ago, we turned them into suspects in an experimental context, but our participants came from a range of backgrounds in that some of them had mental health conditions and some of them didn't. So we had a vulnerable group and a non-vulnerable group as well. And this is a brief overview of our findings. So we found that when we used the modified interview technique, so the interview technique that contained more specific or closed style questions, vulnerable participants tended to provide more information compared to when they were asked open questions. But as we would expect, we found that non-vulnerable participants responded better to best practice interviews, so those that asked open questions. And then the 2 graphs that you have in front of you, the one on the left-hand side refers to the accuracy of the information that participants provided. So again, we can see in the first 2 columns there, the mentally disordered participants provided more accurate information in the modified interview, which is the green column, and those that weren't vulnerable provided more accurate information in the best practice interview. We also wanted to see if the types of questions that were being asked were causing any confusion. And the way we measured this was how many times a participant, when they were being interviewed, would seek clarification. So again, you can see in the first 2 columns there, that's the mentally disordered participant group. The best practice model, the column in blue, tended to elicit a higher number of clarifications in that vulnerable suspect group compared to those that weren't vulnerable and compared to the modified interview. So this experimental work suggests that actually vulnerable participants respond, or vulnerable suspects respond better to a modified interview technique. So why is this important? Well, all individuals are entitled to justice, and that includes vulnerable suspects. Those who are vulnerable must not be excluded or marginalised because of their vulnerability and because of their needs. When we talk about vulnerability, there are so many different connotations, so many different definitions, that it can make it very difficult to know what to do with that particular vulnerable group. But we do know that the interview methods have to match the cognitive abilities of the vulnerable person. And if not, what that can lead to is a heightened risk of miscarriages of justice and false confessions. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Keith, who's going to talk you through a case study where he was dealing with a vulnerable suspect. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Keith, and thank you to Susanna and Chris for allowing me to have this opportunity to discuss a case study that I personally worked on. And thank you to everybody for coming along and listening. Just before I move to the next slide, this case study does involve some sensitive information in relation to sexual abuse. If anybody's uncomfortable, then you know, you may decide to leave. That's fine. But hopefully it's not going to be too taxing for any of you. So I want to talk about a gentleman called Robert Smith, who was a husband, a father, and a grandfather, and he was 60 years old. Police were informed that he had sexually abused his granddaughter in Spain and in England, and the abuse had spanned over a period of around 2 years. The report to the police was made by his ex-wife, who was mother to his daughter, his granddaughter, mother to his daughter, and grandmother to his granddaughter, the victim. His granddaughter at the time of the report was 13 years old. So I knew that the alleged abuse had begun when she was around about 11 years old. So what I want to talk about is, before any interview, the initial inquiries that police would do in these circumstances. First and foremost, it's to obtain more information from the informant, his ex-wife, and quite crucial is, how has she become aware of the alleged abuse, and when did she become aware? From that point, you move on to the victim, and the task for myself is to obtain an initial disclosure from the victim, his granddaughter, and establish if she wishes to take part in an interview, if there's criminal allegations are made out. Now, for those who may be well aware of it, these interviews are known as achieving best evidence interviews, and it's how we glean the information from children or vulnerable adults who have been involved in some sort of complex abuse. If the victim wishes to take part in the ABA interview, it's my role then to arrange the services of a registered intermediary, which Laura is one, as Chris told you at the beginning. And in this case, the victim would get a registered intermediary because she was vulnerable due to her age. So my further inquiries reveal that Smith had allegedly been chronically sexually abusing various members of his family, including his ex-wife. Most of the family members had an awareness of the abuse within the family. Now, on the face of it, this is not a complex case for the police. Once all the safeguarding actions are carried out, i.e. anything we can put in place to prevent Smith from having any contact with children or vulnerable adults, it's routine, proportionate, evidential inquiries. However, Smith is a vulnerable adult. He is an alcoholic. He suffers with anxiety and depression. He is also mute with very limited British Sign Language. My inquiries revealed that there were 5 victims identified within the family and 1 victim outside of the family environment who had all allegedly been abused. They were all vulnerable due to their age, i.e. they were children or they had mental health issues. Each of the victims were afforded the benefit of a registered intermediary to assist with the interviews and obtaining their evidence. Now, my role is to obtain an account from Smith once I've obtained the accounts from all of the victims and witnesses. Now, this was difficult. As I've pointed out, he is a vulnerable adult. He's mute. So from the outset, I knew that I was going to have to move away from best practice of interviewing. Your traditional TED questions were unlikely to work in this instance. I needed an appropriate adult to be present and assist. However, due to the family awareness of what had been going on, then it was my decision that no family member would be an appropriate adult. Now, you can see already that Smith is not getting the same right as vulnerable victims, such as a registered intermediary. A victim or a witness gets a registered intermediary. The suspect, they get an appropriate adult, which quite often are untrained and not skilled as much as a registered intermediary. Excuse me. So now the suspect interview was made much more complex due to his vulnerability, due to the vulnerabilities of Smith. For instance, any interview, there's an explanation of their legal rights. Their right to have somebody that they're under arrest, the right to legal representation, their right to have a look at a book called the Codes of Practice, our PACE books. Now, for me to explain this to somebody who has vulnerabilities due to depression and anxiety, who is also mute, this in itself was quite a taxing process. Then there's the explanation of a caution. So you do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything that you do say may be given in evidence. Now, I would suggest anybody listening to that now has already forgot what I said at the beginning. So that had to be broken down into very small, minute sections so that the interpreter could interpret it for Smith, and so that the appropriate adult also had an understanding of it. So we had three people who had to have a thorough understanding of the caution. We're already probably, which is routine for a police interview, which would be maybe 10 minutes into the interview, we're probably at a 25 to 30 minutes, and we haven't asked a single question about any of the alleged offences. Now, when you've heard Laura talking about free recall and your tell, explain, describe questions, this was not going to be possible because of the communication barriers. So questions instantly began with quite closed and specific questions. So rather than tell me what happened in Spain, the questions were you in Spain? When did you go to Spain? Who did you go to Spain with? So that Smith had specific targets to answer the questions with. Now, you can also imagine that generally during police interviews, we as police officers would, afford opportunities for breaks, but quite often it would be the suspect themselves who would say, or would request a break, and we would give them a break. Now, you can imagine a guy with these communication difficulties probably found himself not in a position to ask for that break due to, quite close questions coming at him quite regularly. The rapport building side of the interview was virtually non-existent. I don't know any sort of British Sign Language. So to build a rapport via an interpreter and with an appropriate adult present is quite a hard task. Overall, if we consider the complexities of the interview and the process of Smith being sort of incarcerated, if you like, the whole interview took longer than most routine interviews. Smith spent a much longer time in custody overall. The account stage of the interview, so the clarifying or challenging his account, was hampered due to communication barriers. So to a certain extent, his responses were a given, and it was really hard to try and challenge. There were areas where, because they didn't marry up with what some of the victims and witnesses had reported, but by and large, it was an interview based on myself asking the question, the interpreter signing the question to Smith, the appropriate adult, you know, kind of nodding their head that they had an understanding and that Smith would have an understanding of that. Smith providing his answer to the interpreter, and then the interpreter providing the answer to me. Quite a long process. And like I say, there was no room in the interview for some sort of rapport that you kind of maintain throughout all interviews. So, following the interview, Smith was charged with scores of sexual offences against children in his family. The one victim who was outside of the family, unfortunately, ended up in hospital through to sort of self-harm issues, and to my knowledge has never ever made a formal complaint against Smith. And he pleaded guilty at Newcastle Crown Court at the earliest opportunity. He received a lengthy custodial sentence and is now on the sex offender register for life. So I know that's quite short, but in conclusion, as a police officer, we always follow the best practice of interviewing. There's no real push for us to come away from that side of interviewing yet. In terms of interviewing vulnerable suspects, there's no training for police officers. A person is a person. They're either a child or they're an adult. With the onset now and the more work that's being done, where we employ registered intermediaries to help us through the interview process, that's a lot of the learning for police, reading the intermediary reports who advise us to avoid certain types of questions, to avoid a leading question, to avoid a tag question, to give third neutral options if it's a forced question, to avoid colours, to avoid dates, to try and keep questions that only contain one point because of their vulnerabilities, and the normal style of interviewing would be too wide for them. I believe that the research needs much more development in the hope really to influence new sort of interview models. On a personal level, I think the police are still using the methods that were employed a number of years ago. They are improving, and there's new ways of police officers coming now who are getting much better training, but by and large, they still need to be taking that leap from the main model of interview and exploring other methods of it. Thank you for your time. This is our research company. This is our Twitter. If you need any more information from us, please get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and hopefully we're back.
We are. Thank you. Thank you, Laura and Keith, for that great presentation. and has given us a lot to think about. We have some questions in the Q&A. If attendees would like to add more, we will get to them. So I'll turn it over to Suzanne for the first one.
Yes, we have a question from Todd about the appropriate adult. So he's asking, the appropriate adult to assist in interviews, who selects this person and what qualifies them as appropriate? What rules surrounding this person? Is this person allowed to interrupt the interview or allowed to conclude the interview, etc.?
Really good question. Thanks, Todd. I'll answer some of it, and then Keith will probably be able to pick up the rest. In England and Wales, our PACE guidance tells us who is an appropriate adult. So it can be a parent or guardian that is not involved in the case, or it can be some other responsible adult, also not involved in the case. So that's really the only criteria. There is a body of research that exists that explores whether it is suitable for a parent or guardian to be an appropriate adult because they don't have any training. What currently exists, or what is beginning to emerge now, is we have something called the National Appropriate Adult Network. And this is an organization that trains smaller organizations, so a group of volunteers. They will train them as appropriate adults, and in terms of what their role is, what their duties are. To answer the part about their duties, they're meant to be there for the whole time that suspect is in custody. They're meant to be there when they're getting searched, when they're having their fingerprints done, during the police interview. Quite often that doesn't happen, and quite often they're only there in the interview. They are there to help facilitate communication, so they can interrupt in the interview if they feel that suspect doesn't understand. But from some of the research I've done, it's not viewed very positively when that happens. It can cause some conflict between the interviewing officer and the appropriate adult. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Thanks for that question, Todd. Having done lots of interviews with appropriate adults involved, we make it clear to the appropriate adults, the police kind of make it clear to the appropriate adults what their role is in that interview. So they're not to just be a bystander. They are there to facilitate understanding and communication between ourselves, the police, and the individual that we're interviewing. 9 times out of 10, that doesn't happen. Most appropriate adults will be pretty much silent for the whole interview, and it's probably due to a power imbalance between the police and the appropriate adult. Now, 9 times out of 10, if we don't use an appropriate adult from within the family, i.e. just a responsible adult, I don't mean just, but a responsible adult, we would go to social services, our local authority, to provide a social worker. And again, some interviews are out of hours, some interviews there's not a social worker available, some social workers don't have the correct skills, some have never worked with vulnerable adults, they've only worked with children. So by and large, they shouldn't be bystanders, and they should intervene where appropriate, as long as it's based on just the fact that the individual doesn't have an understanding. And just finally, I think I heard you say, can they conclude the interview? If I've picked that up right, no, they shouldn't be concluding the interview. That should be, as it stands, the police officer or the legal representative, who can then say he's not going to answer more questions. I recommend a conclusion, but by and large, that's up to the police to conclude the interview.
Thank you so much. I think that answers the questions very well. We have a few more if you want to take them live as well. So one is, give me a second. It's coming more and more questions, so they keep popping up on my screen here. So I'll just decide on whichever came first. Yes, this is from Lauren Morgan. Do you think it would be helpful for suspects to also be eligible for a registered intermediary? reasons why that wouldn't be appropriate?
No, yes, they definitely do. So as Chris mentioned at the start, I work as a registered intermediary as well. As registered intermediaries in England and Wales, we are trained and accredited with the Ministry of Justice. We have to go through quite a tough training process, and each year we have to go through almost like a re-accreditation process to keep us within our role. And then you see the alternative or the opposite for appropriate adults for vulnerable suspects, where a lot of the time they are untrained. So to give you an example, I was at court last week working with an individual who within that context was a vulnerable victim, but he was also a prisoner, he was also an offender, and he had an extensive offending history. So when I started working with him, I was called in because he was within this victim context, so he got the role of a registered intermediary. But when I spoke with him, he told me that he didn't even have an appropriate adult for any of the other times he was a vulnerable suspect at the police station. So you can see the disparity in terms of the safeguards available. And for me, witnessing his communication needs and the assistance that he needed at court, to think that he didn't have any assistance the other 44 times that he was at court is quite shocking. I know that it is in the legislation, but it's not been enacted yet. So a judge can make an order in England and Wales for a registered intermediary to help a vulnerable defendant at trial, but that is on a sort of case-by-case basis. And they certainly don't assist the vulnerable suspect during the police interview. But to answer your question in short, yes, there definitely should be for both.
Thank you so much. We have another question here as well, if you don't mind me just continuing, Chris, Laura, and Kate. It's from Susan Brandon. A big question, this one. So she asks, the research is suggesting that the police officer must make a determination regarding the mental status of the individuals that they talk with, but they're not generally trained to make these kinds of clinical judgments. How do we deal with this?
Yeah.
Shall I go?
Yeah, go, yeah.
You're quite right. Police officers are not trained to make that judgment. So a lot of it is trying your best to communicate with the individual before the interview in some sort of assessment way. So trying to find out whether they went to a mainstream school, whether they've suffered with, mental health issues such as PTSD or anxiety or depression. And on this case in particular, the one I've talked about today, the only way there was for me to do that was to talk to family members about the mental state of Smith. Without if we forget Smith was mute, any other sort of vulnerable adult, it would be a case of just trying to use our professional thoughts and just trying to glean as much information as we can. And if there's the slightest suspicion that we think they're vulnerable, then we would automatically look to get an appropriate adult.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that's one of the issues that we have in England and Wales is that police officers are not clinicians. It would take a clinical psychologist around 2 hours to complete a full clinical assessment. The training that police officers have for vulnerability is limited and very ad hoc, depending where you are in the country. So it really is just sort of depending on professional judgment. Some of the police officers I've worked with have said to me, there was just something about them. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's just something not right. And so they've trusted that gut instinct and then sought the appropriate services. But I've had other police officers say to me that they use Google to look up symptoms and things like that, which can be very informative, but obviously shouldn't be really used as a way to identify vulnerable people. So yes, it is a big issue in England and Wales, definitely.
Dr. Google is not always to be trusted.
Is he not?
So we've got another one coming from the US, another one from the US. This is Jim Halsmer. Jim, I recognize you and I are playing email tag. Be that as it may, he says, thank you for sharing the case study, Keith. Do police agencies have the adequate time and staff or the resources to deal with the complexity and growing need to work with the vulnerable? If not, how are they preparing for it?
The short answer is no, they do not. How they're preparing for it is with vulnerable adults, whether they be suspects, victims, or witnesses, then there'll be a priority around them, and that's not necessarily due to the criminal aspect of the case, but to do with their vulnerability in terms of safeguarding. So for that case in particular, that it was recognized swiftly that had to be dealt with really quick because he was a vulnerable adult, and we'd identified a number of victims within the family setup. So not only, despite what he's been convicted of, he was at risk from his family as well, now that this was all coming to fruition. What you do have in our country is you have a push from our prosecution services, our justice system, to try and get these cases to fruition in court a lot quicker. There's certain time scales in relation to sexual offenders and sexual offending. But in terms of preparing police officers, it's almost just trying to prioritize it.
Great, thank you. We've got another one. We do have a few more minutes before our hour is up, but anonymous attendee says, hi there, thank you for all this information. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how investigators can best assess the vulnerability of suspects. This is similar to a question I think we've already addressed. How investigators can best assess the vulnerability of the suspects they're handling and thus know how to best proceed with their interviewing practice, knowing that there is often a lack of time and resources afforded for proper planning, which we also had a comment from Ray Bull about planning and the importance of it. And so maybe that's the heart of the question here about planning, and that it's often an overlooked important stage of an interview.
Yeah, definitely.
You could probably talk better about how.
Yeah, I think the planning and preparation is really important, especially when you've got a vulnerable person. Sometimes the vulnerability isn't identified until you get into that police interview or till you get to trial, and then things just have to stop, and then you have to seek the appropriate services. I think doing the planning and preparation is really pivotal, and as Keith mentioned, trying to gather as much information as you can. You know, did they go to a mainstream school or special needs? Have they been under the sort of child and adolescent mental health services? Do they have any support workers? Do they live independently in the community? All of these aspects can help you ascertain a decision quite quickly.
Right. A last second question came in from Maria, and I think it's really important, and another comment addressed this question of rapport and building rapport with vulnerable suspects and the possible challenges that go along with that. And so what would you say about rapport building with vulnerable suspects?
From my perspective, it's as necessary with any interview, whether they're vulnerable or not. The rapport building is only, it can be hampered because of the police officer's inability to build up that communicative sort of relationship, especially when you're talking about people who may, not do well in social situations, such as autistic individuals and people who are suffering from some sort of trauma. And I think with vulnerability from the police officer side, it's easy for a police officer to kind of close down, because communication is quite often a two-way matter, isn't it? So if I'm asking questions, prior to the interview, just to build rapport, like, what did you watch on TV last night? And the guy doesn't talk back, the rapport starts to get harder and harder. So it's knowing your way around that that's important.
And I think that's, again, you know, something that you see big differences in between vulnerable victims and vulnerable suspects. So as the registered intermediary assisting a vulnerable victim, as part of my assessment, I spend a significant amount of time building rapport with that individual, exploring how they communicate, what they like to communicate about, what are their safe topics. And that assessment is conducted in the presence of the police officer who is then going to interview them.
Yeah.
So we have these discussions, the police officer is involved in those discussions, and we have the time to do that. And then we do the interview on another day. With a vulnerable suspect, the appropriate adult doesn't conduct an assessment.
No.
They turn up to custody. They might spend 5 or 10 minutes with that vulnerable suspect, and then they're straight into the interview. So they don't have the time or the capacity to develop that rapport, which can then make it very difficult for the police officer to be able to do that.
Yeah, agree.
Well, thank you very much, Laura and Keith. I think we'll end it there. That's our hour. And Suzanne, any last thoughts?
I don't think so. I just want to congratulate you both, Laura and Keith, for a fantastic presentation, and well done, Chris and Brendan, for hosting. This was extremely interesting, and I yeah, look forward to future discussions from IIRG in Conversation.
Yeah, and speaking of that, we will be announcing shortly our first webinar in 2025. It'll happen early February, so stay tuned for that. And also, I know many people are on tenterhooks about our next in-person conference, which will be in July 2026. So stay tuned for all of those. And we will give the last word to Laura and Keith.
Thank you very much
Thank you.
for having us. We hope that was helpful, and look forward to coming to the next conference.
Thanks
Look
now.
forward to seeing you.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you all. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.